In the 23rd century, a tense war of nerves is being waged between the Federation and the Klingon Empire. This is not a war of soldiers and starships, but a war of influence, ideas, and prestige, whose battles are not fought in deep space, but on the design and drawing boards of new and ambitious technologies and the mighty starships that will go on to employ them. In this war of technology, no idea is too unorthodox or unconventional if it leads to one gaining the advantage over their rival. And so, when Starfleet learns of an ambitious new Klingon project, she desperately seeks an equally ambitious and unorthodox solution, one that takes the form of a great experiment. In the early stages of the 4 Years' War, Starfleet learned to its cost that in the modern battlespace, warp speed and strategic maneuver were the key factors. While Starfleet vessels of the time were generally larger and more powerful than their Klingon counterparts, Klingon warp technology and tactical doctrine allowed for the rapid redeployment of Klingon forces. This was due to the nature of Klingon warp geometry, which placed the nacelles below and to the rear of the ship's centre of mass, which imparted greater acceleration and manoeuvrability when travelling at warp speeds, though this came at the cost of lower top speeds and a lower overall cruising speed. Even so, in the early phases of the war, these advantages far outweighed the disadvantages, and the Klingons were able to consistently outmaneuver and outfight Starfleet. However, in the latter stages of the war, newer Federation ships, such as the Constitution and Lochnar class, were able to turn the tide, taking advantage of the newest developments in warp field geometry, with the nacelles now mounted at high angles closer to the ship's centre of mass. This offered significantly higher warp speeds and a greater overall cruising speed, and this allowed Starfleet to dictate the pace of engagements, outmaneuvering Klingon forces and gaining overall deep space superiority. While the Klingons were unable to offer a response before the war's end in 2244, they would in 2257 unveil their counter to the Constitution in the form of the new D-7 class battlecruiser, which could match the firepower of the Constitution and had greater agility at the cost of lower warp speeds and weaker defences. However, this was deemed acceptable in Klingon doctrine, as they planned for the D-7 to be built in far larger scale than that of the Constitution. Even so, Starfleet remained confident in the capabilities of their Constitution-class cruisers, being the most capable ship in the quadrant, or so they believed. Starfleet would double down on the success of the Constitution with an unprecedented refit in 2270. This package saw wholesale upgrades to every aspect of the class, from propulsion to sensor systems. The new refit of the Constitution represented an exponential increase in its capabilities, and while the D-7 saw similar upgrades in the Katinga refit, it was not nearly as extensive and was largely limited to tactical systems, and as such, the capability gap between the two grew. This was not lost on Klingon Chancellor Kesh, who mandated a top-secret Starship design program. The requirement stated that it outgun any known Starfleet vessel by a factor of 2, and to have a cruising speed greater than that of the Constitution refit. This project was so veiled in secrecy that it was not until 2279 that Starfleet intelligence caught wind of this ambitious project, obtaining long-range visual scans of the ships under construction later that year. While only possessing low-resolution scans, the ship was identified as the B-10. However, the Klingons named her Invincible. This 4-nacelle design, along with its dual reactor systems, would give the B-10 warp speed performance far in excess of any Starfleet vessel of the time, and while its armament was unknown, given the space frame's large size, of 343 meters, it was projected to far outgun any Federation ship in service. With this shocking revelation, Starfleet Command issued a requirement in 2280 for a next-generation heavy cruiser capable of outperforming the B-10 at warp and carrying sufficient armament to at least pose a threat to the B-10. Several designs were proposed, however, none offered the performance needed to outrun the B-10, except one, a proposal submitted by Professor Zyrax of the Daystrom Institute in cooperation with Commander Samuel Lewis of the Advanced Starship Design Bureau, who proposed a ship that would utilize transwarp drive. The term transwarp drive has always been somewhat nebulous and subject to change as technology advances, but broadly refers to any propulsion system that achieves faster than light speeds without employing a typical warp field, and often offers far greater speeds than available in typical warp drive. In this particular instance, Professor Zyrax proposed tying the ship's transporter system into the warp matrix, augmenting the warp field with an additional field that would be projected ahead of the ship, allowing the ship to travel at far greater speeds than with conventional warp drive. A warp field, being a gravity field, shrinks the space around it, technically distorting time and space. The greater the gravitational force, the slower time moves. However, since conventional warp drive exerts gravitational force in all directions, all time is slowed equally, and so other than accomplishing a journey that would take centuries in mere days, conventional warp drive maintains the equilibrium of time in normal space. However, transwarp drive utilizes the ship's transporter system to project a second warp field ahead of the ship as it travels, further folding the space in front of the ship, slowing the passage of time ahead of the ship, since time is not being slowed equally across all of space. This creates a temporal imbalance, which physics resolves by shifting the temporal disparity into the bubble, that is, the ship, allowing the rest of space to maintain a temporal equilibrium. Thus, the ship in question technically travels at the same speed but over a shorter time frame. To put it another way, imagine undertaking a journey that takes you 30 minutes. However, by employing transwarp drive, you can accomplish it in 15 minutes, with the clock at your home and destination showing the passage of only 15 minutes. However, your watch inside the transwarp field states that 30 minutes still passed on the journey. However, as far as the rest of the world is concerned, you accomplished the journey in 15 minutes, even though you yourself experienced 30 minutes. And so, the cost of using transwarp drive is that you have aged an additional 15 minutes compared to the rest of the universe. And so employing transwarp drive is not without cost and must be employed carefully. While it can be used to travel between 2 points quicker, it is most useful when employed as a means of engaging and intercepting an enemy starship. Any vessel in the path of a transwarp vessel, no matter how fast, will always be outrun by the transwarp drive, since no matter how fast it appears to be travelling, to a transwarp vessel it is effectively running on the spot, since the transwarp vessel is effectively pulling the proverbial carpet of space from underneath the other starship as it moves forward itself. Thus, in theory, a vessel equipped with transwarp drive would not only outperform the B-10, but any and all future conventional warp drive ships. However, Starfleet Command was extremely skeptical of this proposal, as their previous forays into the fields of alternative drive systems in the 2250s had been an unmitigated disaster, with both prototypes simply vanishing out of existence. Only when faced with the supposedly unmitigated threat of the B-10, was Starfleet even willing to hear such a proposal, and only approved it as the only viable option. And so, Starfleet Command approved the proposal in 2281, and Professor Zyrax and Samuel Lewis were transferred to the Antares shipyards to oversee the development and construction of a prototype, which was to be completed no later than 2285. This tight deadline of only 4 years placed a huge amount of pressure on the design team and forced them to focus on design essentials rather than any additional features. In order for this transwarp concept to function, 3 key systems would have to be developed. 1. A power plant sufficient to support not only the transwarp drive, but the ship's tactical system, with which it would confront the B-10. 2. A navigational system, which could not only make the necessary calculations and control for safe operation of the transwarp drive, but also capable of tracking and engaging targets while under transwarp power. And 3. A transporter grid that would have enough power to project the transwarp field ahead of the ship. The issue of power was solved with relative ease. Since 2270, Starfleet had begun to employ vertical collision warp cores, which were far more efficient than the older Archer-style engines. However, their large height made them difficult to fit within the space frames of the time, with ships like the Constitution class having it run the entire draft of the ship, making what was already a weak spot in the neck an even more critical weakness. Therefore, while the new class would use the same power plant as the Constitution, it would be the first time that it would be installed on a vessel that was built from the ground up to accommodate this new technology. Thus, the ship would see a significant increase in hull mass, particularly in the neck and secondary hull, to safely accommodate the power plant and improving structural integrity. The issue of the transporter system was next to be resolved. The ship, already shaping up to be larger than anything in service, would require multiple transporters, and so Commander Lewis theorized that if chained together in a transporter array, they would have sufficient power to project the warp field ahead of the ship. And so the transporter array would be built in parallel to the ship's central power grid, tying it directly into the main reactor, allowing the transporter system far more power than typically available, which had numerous advantages outside of the transwarp drive. The last hurdle for the design team to overcome was that of the computer system, as the flight control and navigational systems required unprecedented levels of processing power. Professor Zyrax, being a member of the Daystrom Institute, was well equipped to solve this issue, and he and his team went about developing the most powerful computer system of the time. Rather than rely on a single large computer core, Zyrax opted for a duotronic system split between the primary hull and saucer section. These 2 computers would be in constant communication, and each contained a backup of the other, and could work in concert for the ship's navigation and flight control, whilst being capable of independent operation, albeit with slower processing speeds. The computer housed in the saucer would be 4 decks tall, twice those carried on the Constitution class, while the Star Drive section played host to a computer core 6 decks tall, far larger than any previous computer system to be mounted on a starship. These 2 cores between them would provide the new class with computing power necessary to support the most advanced navigational system devised, along with a flight control system which relied almost entirely on fly-by-wire systems. With the blueprints completed late 2283, construction of the prototype swiftly followed, with the perceived threat of the B-10 continuing to loom large. Starfleet Command was desperate to have a response ready, though they had not received any suggestion that the B-10 program had advanced any further. Nonetheless, when the prototype was completed in 2285 and given a fitting name, USS Excelsior NX-2000 at 467 meters long, 177 meters wide and 75 meters tall. The Excelsior is far larger not only than the humble Constitution, but the long-dreaded B-10 itself. She boasted a formidable armament for her day, with 10 dual-phaser batteries and 7 single-phaser turrets, along with 4 prow and 2 aft torpedo tubes, making her one of, if not the most powerful class of its time, rivaled only by the Romulan Nova-class battleship. She may well have been more than a match for the B-10. However, for better or for worse, this encounter was never to be, as the B-10 project was trapped in development, racking up cost overruns and failing to meet deadlines. Unlike the Excelsior, which saw a highly focused development with strict requirements and deadlines, the B-10 program was characterized by a lack of clear requirements or a singular driving vision, with the project constantly being halted to make use of newer technologies as they emerged, resulting in an overblown design which, while impressive, was of very little strategic use. However, Excelsior was not without her own troubles. Beginning trials in 2285, problems soon emerged, mostly in relation to the transwarp drive system. In her first attempt at transwarp, the ship's flight computer crashed, and while attempts were made to rectify this issue through software patches, the flight computer remained unstable, and while on other Starfleet vessels, manual control could be used in lieu of computer systems, this was simply not an option for the transwarp drive, which heavily relied on computer control. Additionally, the transporter grid was incredibly inconsistent and often suffered power overloads mid-flight, causing the transwarp field to disintegrate, as the transporter systems were not built to handle the power demands placed upon it. And while the system may have run more smoothly with the addition of purpose-built transporters, this was not done, as it would lead to even more development time and cost overruns. But ultimately, the final nail in the coffin of the transwarp drive was the human factor. Crew fatigue derived from the effects of transwarp was a very real issue, with many crewmen rendered medically unfit to serve on such a ship. Additionally, in order to accommodate the crew, the transwarp drive could not be used to its full effect without artificially aging its crew at dangerous rates, and while attempts were made to remedy this by rotating crew members on and off the ship, this only exacerbated the mechanical issues with the addition of unfamiliar personnel. Despite these attempts at perseverance, the project remained in an endless loop of testing, modification, and retesting, until in 2287, Starfleet intelligence reported that Chancellor Kesh officially cancelled the B-10 project, and Starfleet Command breathed a sigh of relief. Initially, Starfleet Command planned to scrap the Excelsior altogether. However, Admiral Cartwright argued that the space frame itself was sound, and would still be a substantial jump in capabilities from the Constitution, and with the cancellation of the B-10 would give them a decisive advantage over the Klingons. This proposal was approved, and the Excelsior would be modified to serve as a traditional heavy cruiser, replacing the Constitution as Starfleet's first-rate ship. With a total of 34 warp coils, she easily outperforms her Constitution predecessor. It was in fact the top speeds achieved by the Excelsior that prompted the redrawing of the warp scale in the 24th century. She would also see modifications to the primary hull, with the addition of a large ventral berth, which could be used to launch long-range probes and to house large irregular loads, such as asteroids, for further analysis, something unthinkable to her smaller predecessor. These modifications were completed in 2288, and the USS Excelsior would be commissioned later that year under the command of Captain Hikaru Sulu, who would lead her on her first 3-year deep space mission exploring the Beta Quadrant. She was soon followed later that year by the USS Proxima, the first of many sister ships. With the success of her first mission and her being instrumental in bringing about the Khitmar Accords, the Excelsior was vindicated as a worthy successor to the venerable Constitution class, and in late 2293 this status would be cemented with the commissioning of the USS Enterprise B, the first of myriad variants. Sporting an enlarged star drive section to house scientific facilities, additional impulse units, and modifications to the nacelles, it made a class originally intended for rapid response into a long-range explorer. Construction of the Excelsior class and her variants would extend well into the 24th century, and it would arguably be the ship to usher in the Federation's golden age, as well as being the benchmark for all future cruisers not only in the Federation but throughout the Alpha and Beta quadrants. And even when surpassed by her rivals, she would remain one of the most ubiquitous ships in Starfleet, even seeing a refit in 2372, keeping it competitive with the ships of the time, preparing it to face the crucible of the Dominion War. The Excelsior served with distinction during the Dominion War, forming the bulwark of Starfleet's cruiser wings throughout the war, and proving Cartwright's conviction that the Excelsior was not only an elegant space frame, but a robust one too, spawning numerous derivatives such as the Centaur and Andor Mark II. Even today, the Excelsior class continues to prove its worth as a capable explorer, continuing to see refits and inspire new classes such as the Resolute class. It is poetic that one of the most successful classes in Starfleet had one of the most infamous and troubled developments in all of Starfleet history, yet despite this, lived up to its namesake, climbing ever upwards in its achievements. The fruit of daring minds and out-of-the-box thinking, the result of a great experiment.